What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the NH Experience here, SiriusXM, and also all streaming platforms. That's Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and Spotify for free 99. I got a very special guest, a legend in the house, no doubt in the media space. She is definitely a contributing writer for The Atlantic. She had a very interesting article as of late. We're going to get into that and more. Also, she's the host of Spotify podcast Jemele Hill Unbothered. She's also the co-founder of Lodge Freeway Media, and she definitely has a memoir, Uphill. Make sure y'all go check it out. If you haven't copped it, it's available everywhere where books are sold. She is the one, the only, the voice of the people. I like to call her the one and only Jemele Hill. How you doing?
I'm good. Good to be here.
Oh, thank you for coming on. I know we've been working on this for quite some time, so I appreciate your time for coming on.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, I mean, there's a lot been going on with you in general, just personally and professionally. So I want to get into a little bit with that as far as just what enabled you to sign with WME, and then what other ventures that you have going on and are coming down the pike.
Well, the move to WME, I was with CAA. I was at CAA from I think 2013 until obviously just recently.
Mhm.
Really enjoyed my experience there. Met a lot of great people. Had some fantastic, agents, and but it felt like it was time for a shift because,
Mhm.
I think you at different points in your career you need different things and at this point, especially being that I do want to return to television in more of a full time capacity, that I needed to be with an agency that was going to be aggressive in seeking those opportunities. And again, that's no shade to CAA, but I felt like right now, when you look at some of the industry leaders in broadcast media, especially in sports. A lot of them are at WME. And, it also helps when you have friends who are also represented by them. Carrie Champion, for example, one of my really good friends, a WME client as well. So I felt really comfortable with them. My agent, Sharon Chang, I had developed a relationship with her years ago. So
Mm.
this was a natural fit for me. In terms of what I have coming down the pipeline, it's a lot. um, yeah, right now, if you want to talk about the podcast space in particular, I narrated a wonderful podcast that's on Audible called Shadow Ball: The Rise of the Black Athlete. These are fantastic stories about Black athletes and Black stories in sports that a lot of people either don't know, have forgotten, or just need a refresher course on. And for example, one of them is Rose Robinson. A lot of people don't know the very first Black athlete to take a knee in protest during the national anthem was a Black woman, Rose
Mm.
Robinson. And her story is crazy. Like it's something that somebody should do a movie or a documentary on. But she did it at the Pan American Games. And so telling her story and other stories, that was a lot of fun to do. So that's out right now, available on Audible, which is obviously through Amazon. I just finished doing some writing and creative consulting for a documentary that's coming out on Netflix this summer about Simone Biles. This is a docu
Ooh.
series about her leading into the Olympics. Simone will be participating, and she's been on quite a journey. The last Olympics she withdrew from some events because of mental health reasons. This is likely her last Olympics in which she'll be competing. She's the greatest gymnast of all time. She has nothing to prove, and yet she's gonna put it on the line anyway. And I think it's just hearing from her the vulnerability, the transparency. I think people are really going to enjoy that. I'm also executive producer of Colin Kaepernick's documentary, which is directed by Spike Lee. That's for ESPN. It's another 30 for 30. And very excited about that project as well. Working on a children's book. And yeah, it's just I have a lot of things kind of going on. And you mentioned my podcast on Spotify, Jemele Hills Unbothered. I actually ended my relationship with Spotify, and so I'm in the process of gathering a new home for Jemele Hills Unbothered. But people, it's still available on Spotify, and actually because I own the intellectual property, very important if you're a podcaster, as you know. Um, The episodes are now out wide, so you can get it wherever you can get Jemele Hill is Unbothered, wherever you get your podcast. I also videoed a lot of them. And so on my YouTube page, you can get full video episodes of some of the wonderful people I've interviewed. In fact, this week, the one that's up is my interview with Mary J. Blige. So I think a lot of people will enjoy that. So yeah, I'm just trying to stay busy and just continuing to develop and nurture the talents that God has given me.
Mhm.
But as you know, in the media game now, is that you got to be a utility player, and I've been able to, through my writing ability, I've been able to branch off and do other types of storytelling, which has been really exciting and beneficial for my career.
Well, using a baseball reference, Jamel Hill is a five-tool player apparently because you got your hands
Exactly.
in everything, which
I
is a
do.
beautiful thing. You talk about obviously those who may not be familiar with your journey. Obviously, you're a graduate of Michigan State. You were a columnist. You moved on to ESPN, doing writing and television for them. You departed from ESPN. I want to ask you because you mentioned about the Colin Kaepernick, and we've been hearing about this documentary for quite some time, and now it's going to ESPN of all places. How did that work? And was that kind of strange for you to have that documentary put on ESPN, a company that you had worked for, but obviously separated for various reasons that we all know?
Well, I know everybody, of course, some of it played out publicly. The thing is, I was at ESPN for 12 years, and it was the best job I ever had. I met a lot of great people there, built a lot of really strong relationships. And although our parting was probably a little awkward, um, it was best for both parties at the time, for sure. And so I never left there holding any ill will toward ESPN. And I think the feeling was mutual. And so when Colin approached me about being the executive producer on his documentary, it was already sold to ESPN, and so he just made it. Frankly, he made it a condition, and not that they needed to be strong armed to do it, but ESPN knew I was going to be working on this, and there was no hard feelings or any they weren't hesitant or anything like that. But me and some of the other ESPN folks who I know very well who are working with this documentary, if anything, we had kind of an amusing laugh about it, like, oh, how things come full circle. And I, would mess with them, be like, you guys are giving me paychecks again. This is wonderful. And so yeah, for me, and Colin, and this says a lot about who he is as a person. When he called me about this documentary, he had multiple offers on the table in terms of distributors and buyers, and he asked my honest opinion about who he should go with. And he didn't need to consult me at all. And
Mhm.
realized that Colin and I, we were probably the best way to put it is that we were friendly associates. Like that wasn't my boy. Like we weren't the best of friends. But the reason he called me is because ESPN was on the table. He knew my situation. He didn't know the ins and outs. And he wanted to make sure that him deciding to go with ESPN wouldn't somehow undermine me. And I thought that was really just stand up of him to do. Again, he didn't have to do that. Had he chosen ESPN, and let's say we had a very nasty fallout, I would not have held that against him. And not only that, it's his life. Like,
Mhm.
my life is my life. His life is his life. If he felt like that was the best decision for him, I certainly wouldn't have lost any respect for him. And so it just says everything about his character that he
Mhm.
checked in with me to ask what I thought about it. And I think he was also wanting to know, given again the awkward way that ESPN and I ended our relationship,
Mhm.
kind of what he was getting into. And when he told me his options, I said, "Listen, ESPN, you saw they won the Oscar with the O.J. Simpson documentary, O.J. Made in America, and they do this work very well. It's the best platform when you consider the ESPN, ABC, Disney link. I was like, I think they're going to be able to tell your story in a really, in a really significant, nuanced, thoughtful way. And I honestly think that that's like the best decision for you to make. And he told me, well, the only way I could see myself doing this is if you join the project. I'm like, don't threaten me with a good time. Say no more. So I joined on, even though I never executive produced a thing in my life. Um, but storytelling is storytelling,
Mhm.
and then the opportunity to work with Spike Lee, one of the greatest living directors that we have, learning from him, seeing his process, realize that all executive producers are, all titles aren't, all responsibilities, I should say, aren't created the same. There's a
Mhm.
lot of executive producers where it's just a vanity title. You're not on set. You don't you don't do much. Sometimes you're just really lending your name to the project to get it sold. But that was not the case for me. I was on set multiple times, and going through the raw footage and those sorts of things. I mean, Spike and his team handled the editing, but I gave notes, and that also was very interesting. I was like, Spike Lee has been up for Oscars. I mean, he this is the guy who directed and gave us Malcolm X, but I'm
Mhm.
giving him notes on his work. I I thought that was really like, is this real life? And so it's just interesting seeing filmmaking from that perspective. And so yeah, I'm looking forward to one day people seeing this.
Well, that serves as a testament to your creativity and your influence as well, just with the entire project. Because obviously, Colin Kaepernick is not an easy project as far as just to be able to sell the layers of who he really is. And the thing with me about Colin is that obviously he was an incredible football player. I mean, he guided the 49ers, your team, to the Super Bowl, so somebody started playing with the lights. And but when you look at obviously the film that we saw on Netflix as far as just what his lifestyle growing up was like, but what are people going to get from this particular film? You believe that they can walk away from something maybe different or something they maybe never even knew about?
There is a lot of things that people didn't know. Um, not to give too much away
Right,
because
right.
I don't want Spike or Colin to kill me. But for example, there's that running narrative, the people who say, well, the reason he's not in the league is because he wasn't good enough, or they point to his final season where the 49ers were not good. They also had one of the least talented rosters in the league. But he still threw, I believe, 16 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. The reason he didn't start at the beginning of the season was not because he was not good, it was because he was hurt. And I think people will get some real compelling insight into the nature and seriousness of the injuries that he had to battle and overcome his final season, or what appears to be his final season in the NFL. And it's a window into the treachery of the NFL, not with the injuries, but with how they operated with him in general. Because Colin, he puts it all out there, he lays it on the line. He's very honest and very transparent. And this is finally his opportunity to tell his story, because his narrative got hijacked early, despite the fact he explained exactly what the protest was about, why he was doing it, and said immediately this was not about patriotism or the military. This was about drawing awareness to police brutality, simple and plain. And him being used as a political football by Donald Trump, some very disingenuous characters trying to paint him as something he wasn't. I think people are going to be ashamed of some of the things that they said, and the imagery of how people treated him. There's I'll give you this. There's a scene in the opening part of part one of the doc where you see people who are taking AR-15s and rifles shooting up his jersey, and it's very powerful. And I think the level of hatred that he faced that during that time is traumatizing. And it was, I could tell that even him, just talking about it, it was very emotional for him. It was certainly emotional for his partner Nessa. Um, and so, yeah, I think the levels that this got, the people who were criticizing him and slamming him will feel ashamed about what they said about this man, when really what he was trying to bring attention to was a massive human rights issue. And as we saw from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor, it's one that still exists. He was right about everything that he said. And so for people to try to paint him as anti-American, was really disgraceful. So I think people will take that among many other takeaways about some of the players behind, and I don't mean actual football players, but some of the players in the plot behind him being blackballed from the league.
I think it was a strong stance for him to take. I always felt like, first of all, for somebody to take that type of stance, and then also what people fail to forget is that he met with the Green Beret member to actually take the knee to be able to
Well,
move forward. Or how did that
I,
go? Am I
well,
missing something here?
I can't say, but
Okay, okay.
let's just say there's going to be a lot more insight about how that actually happened,
Ooh, okay.
and I'll
The
just leave it at that.
No, I got you. I got you. 'Cause
Yeah,
I don't want to get you in trouble. So I
yeah.
will say this, but for just Colin to take the stance that he took at the time that he took it. And we talk about Muhammad Ali, we talk about Spencer Haywood, we talk about Kirk Flood, as far as those individuals being vocal, obviously taking on the Supreme Court in their various leagues. The one thing I did not understand, and I was the one, I don't want to say knock, but the one thing I did was that I felt like Colin wasn't vocal enough as far as getting his message out there. Do you feel like he wasn't at that time? He should have been more vocal, or do you feel like he did exactly what he should have done at that moment?
No, I think he was vocal. The thing is, his megaphone isn't as loud as the 600 people a day chiming in. It's that
Mm-hmm.
when he first was asked about this in the preseason, because he took this knee in the preseason, he detailed why he did it. Okay, and then he was on camera detailing why he did it. Like, there are multiple incidents where Colin explained exactly what he was doing. But we live in a 24-hour news cycle. And this wasn't a story just limited to ESPN. This was on Fox, CNN, MSNBC, covered internationally. He's not as loud as them. He's not as loud as the people. He could tell people till he was blue in the face what this protest was about. And when the president decides that he's going to use him to curry favor with the people he wants to curry favor with, he is not a match for the most powerful person. Well, at the time, Donald Trump, I believe, was running for president. So he hadn't won it yet, but he still used his name after that. He's not a match against the most powerful man in the world. So I don't know, how much more he could have done. And the other part too, this is one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't situations. Even after, he was, even after he wasn't a member of the 49ers, um, Colin never wanted it to be about him. And he's very sensitive to that and cognizant of that, because I promise, had he been on news programs, had he been making the media rounds, everybody would have accused him of being an attention whore. And when he didn't do that, then it's, well, your message is being corrupted. No, you're choosing to misunderstand. That's a different choice. Okay. And so uh I think he made a wise decision in choosing not to argue with people who were intent on taking his message and taking his action and demonstration for their own gain and using it as a tool of divisiveness when that was never what it was meant to be. It's like, how many times in history we got to learn this? Every time there's a black athlete in particular who decides to take a similar stand, who speaks out, they get completely castigated, they get criticized, and then years later we come back and like, oh, they were right. Well, why do we have to keep learning that way? It's like, we know they're right. Muhammad Ali was right. Okay. And so I feel like this is just a reflexive response to black outspokenness, black empowerment, and black liberation.
I'm definitely looking forward to watching this story. I think it's based upon what you're telling me, and I'm sure we're going to see as it gets closer to date the preview and the trailers and things of that nature. And I'm glad that it's a story that he is still alive to be able to be in front of, to be able to tell and make sure that the stories are told the way that they need to be told. Speaking of, we talk about Colin Kaepernick being a quarterback, a black quarterback, but the evolution. I want to ask you about the evolution of the black quarterback, because we know obviously uh, you know, Lamar Jackson. We know about the greatness of Patrick Mahomes, which you wrote about in the Atlantic, comparing him to Tom Brady, and we consider Tom Brady to be the GOAT with his 7 championships and whatnot. But I want to read to my audience something that you wrote that I felt that was very, very compelling. And you said that Mahomes was more of an elite talent than Brady was at this stage of his career. Brady and Mahomes each won their first Super Bowl when they were 24, and Brady won his third championship when he was 27. But Mahomes stands alone as the youngest player to ever win the league MVP and Super Bowl MVP in the same season. Mahomes also has more passing yards and touchdowns than Brady did in his 20s. Black players had to fight against widely held beliefs that were that they were incapable of mastering the quarterback position or being the face of a franchise. Warren Moon is the only black quarterback in the NFL Pro Football Hall of Fame, excuse me. In order to play quarterback, he had to first spend 6 seasons playing in the Canadian Football League known as the CFL. Where have you seen the evolution, or has there been a significant evolution of the black quarterback in the NFL in the last maybe 10, 15 years?
Well, the biggest evolution has been opportunity, and like Fritz Pollard was the first black quarterback to play in the NFL. It wasn't the modern NFL that we know now. James Shaq Harris was the first black quarterback to play in the modern NFL, and this is part of the history that people forget about it. Forget about the league. You know, after Fritz Pollard won a championship, the NFL actually banned black players for 12 years. Banned them. They could not play in the league. Okay. And so had that not happened, we would have gotten to the point of where a black quarterback starting would not be, and it's not now. We would have gotten to that point of where a black quarterback starting for a franchise would have been less of an anomaly, but their opportunities were blocked. And even later on, once that ban was lifted, and once there were more black players coming into the league, as those players of that era will tell you, if they played quarterback, they were discouraged from playing it. Number one, they were told to switch positions, which more Warren Moon was. Warren Moon led Washington to a Rose Bowl. He has so many significant passing records. He's one of the greatest passers in NFL history. And they told him to change positions. And the reason they did had everything to do with the fact that it was a widely held belief that black quarterbacks could not be leaders. They couldn't be leaders of men. They couldn't be faces of franchises. And even with James Shaq Harris, when you look at what happened to him, he only started one season. And they told him, you got to change positions, even though they won more games with him.
Mhm.
And so they've had to fight against opportunity and fight against this racist stereotype, which you see is the same thing that happened when it came to black coaches, is that, you know, they're fine with making black men the labor and the mule, not fine with them being the leaders. And what has happened is that, much like we saw the same thing in college football only earlier, you know, college football wouldn't exist today if Southern teams, especially if they hadn't rated the talent of HBCUs, because that's what saved the game. All right, you know, my alma mater, Michigan State. Duffy Doherty, legendary coach, he won multiple national championships because he was one of the first white coaches to actually start recruiting black players. And if that hadn't happened in college football, again, the sport would not look anything like what it looks today. And so what you saw was, once black quarterbacks got the opportunity, they started to change how the position was supposed to be played.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there used to be this complete love affair with, you know, stiff, tall white guys that just sat in the pocket and pick teams apart, and that's fine, and that worked for a while, or just pocket quarterbacks in general. But as defensive players got faster, they out there running 4.5s and 4.4s, they needed somebody mobile in order to keep pace with the athleticism that was infused in the game. And a lot of black quarterbacks had those abilities naturally. And what it took, the other evolution that had to happen, is that coordinators and coaches had to start designing systems to play to their skill set, as opposed to having a system and forcing you into that system, despite the fact that your skill set may not be suited for that. They had to start adapting to how black quarterbacks play the position. And so we see that evolution. You know, we see how that evolution has grown. I mean, it's too bad somebody like Cordell Stewart wasn't in today's game, because those of us who watched Cordell Stewart at Colorado, who watched him, you know, playing with the Steelers, like, sometimes that was a very awkward fit because they did not understand how to play with Slash, who was one of the greatest
Mm-hmm.
athletes, and, you know, to play the position. He had a good NFL career, but I felt like his career could have been greater had the game adapted to where it is right now. Colin is an example of that. A lot of the stuff that you saw Colin run in San Francisco, you see Lamar Jackson run because it's successful, and other quarterbacks across the league. Even Josh Allen. It's not just limited to black quarterbacks. There's a lot of
Mhm.
white dudes that are hella athletic too that can play the position. And so I say all that to say the evolution, once the opportunity was there, I think black quarterbacks effectively changed what was expected of that position in terms of what they need a quarterback to do. These defenses are too good. They need quarterbacks who are mobile, who are shifty, who are athletic, and it's unfortunate it's taken this long. It's taken this long for that to happen, but nevertheless, this past season at the start of 2023, the start of the NFL season in 2023, the most black quarterbacks starting for teams is the most they've had in history. It was 14. So almost half the league had a black starting quarterback. So to go from not letting black quarterbacks play at all to now having, to having 14 starters in 2023 is a heck of a story arc.
Absolutely. I want to get your perspective on this too, because when I look at Patrick Mahomes, as great as he is, and I look at Lamar Jackson, two-time MVP, had arguably one of the greatest seasons of his career yet. Why is there such a difference being made with Lamar Jackson versus Patrick Mahomes? Is it the look? Is it the sound? Or is it just, what do you feel it is?
I think it's a lot of that. A lot of it is optics. And unfortunately, Lamar Jackson has been, he's really been not just undermined is not the right word, but he's really been victimized by unfortunately, some stereotypes that black quarterbacks have always had to live with. Um, he even going down to something aesthetically. He reminds me of like his impact culturally. He's Allen Iverson. That's what he reminds me of, because Allen Iverson was somebody with his look, his optics, the way he carried himself, different, and he was somebody a lot of people could relate to, especially black folks. Culturally, we identified with him. And he was in a league that did not understand that culture, who did not understand the relatability. And because of that, he paid the price for those stereotypes. And the way people characterized his game, characterized him, was something that just stuck to him. And I think because Lamar Jackson's mother represents him, because he has the braids. He's still a young, single. Patrick Mahomes has a wife and kids. And for some people who are not forward thinking in their mind, Patrick Mahomes looks the part and
Mm.
Lamar Jackson doesn't. And so I think for a lot of people who characterize his game, who commentate on him, that you can hear the bias. You can hear it. I when I like a lot of people, I watched Lamar Jackson in college. And this idea that he wasn't a good passer, I don't know where it came from. I was like, maybe they see in different games than I'm seeing. And, much like a lot of young quarterbacks, of course, you have to work on touch and accuracy and all those things, but every quarterback kind of has to work on those things. But they were really trying to act like he was Tim Tebow. And no disrespect, but they were trying to act like this man was throwing backwards. Like, no, this is not what's happening. Okay. And because they had that stereotype and were so committed to it, that when he started to showcase all of his abilities, people acted like it was some kind of fluke, and they still treat him like that. I know that Baltimore, there was a lot of expectations, and for a good part of the season, they looked like the best team in the NFL. The Chiefs, they had some up and down, a lot of up and down moments. So, but the thing is, like, there's no shame in losing to who might turn out to be, probably is the greatest quarterback in this generation. Tom Brady kept a lot of people from winning rings. Patrick Mahomes looks like the person who's about to keep a lot of people from winning rings. And it ain't just Lamar Jackson. Josh Allen is like, I wish homie would go to another team. All right. So, I feel like even though he's a two-time MVP, Lamar Jackson still feels underrated to me in many regards. But this is what we can't have happen is the media trying to create create a unspoken rivalry between Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson. Of course, they want to beat each other because they're competing for the same thing. But what I see happening is them using Patrick Mahomes as a way to denigrate Lamar Jackson, and I don't like it personally.
Yeah, I looked at it as I think from my perspective, first of all, I've always said Lamar Jackson has done more with less up until this season. For him to be the 2019 MVP, to not really have a whole lot of help at that time. No more, obviously, he got more help this season, and he earned it every bit of it. But to me, it seems like a complexion thing. Like, hey, we want to have this person who favors closer to this versus the person that's farther away from this standard. And that to me was complete BS. And I agree with you. I don't like it. I think these are two talented quarterbacks. I do think Lamar Jackson will win the championship. I think he'll get his Hakeem Olajuwon on at some point where he'll get a ring or two maybe before his career is done. But I just want to see guys go out there and compete. And I wish they would just let guys go out there and compete no matter where you come from. They can compete. This man has gotten better each and every year to where he is now, a two-time MVP. And that's just what it needs to be. I'm sick and tired of hearing extracurricular commentary from people that are culturally clueless.
Yeah, I mean, I think culturally clueless is a great way to put it. And there's no shame to losing to Patrick Mahomes, but if you watch Lamar Jackson this season, particularly, of course, I think instinctually, in many ways, you see that when he first came into the league, like, of course, he relied on his legs. I mean, I don't really blame him. He's still pretty successful doing it, so who cares? But this season in particular, you saw him put so many components of his game together, which leads me to believe it's just like you, it's a win and not an if he wins a championship. I think he will be able to do it eventually. But for now, the road to the Super Bowl goes through Patrick Mahomes. And if Patrick Mahomes is able to do this in a down year, that is frightening because we saw, how his wide receivers were really like the weakest unit of the offense. If they decide to bolster that group in the offseason, I was watching ESPN today and they were saying how like Mike Evans is right there. And I'm like, oh God, if Mike Evans gets with Patrick Mahomes,
I
it's gonna be lights out.
I mean, and I listen, Patrick Mahomes. I am not betting against Patrick Mahomes, much like how I stopped betting against Brady when he was in his core. Okay, I'm not betting against Patrick Mahomes anymore. Until that man is completely out of position to win something, I'm going to put my money on him in the meanwhile. But I think with the restructuring of his contract, they're only going to get better. Andy Reid is not going anywhere. You got Travis Kelce for a couple more years. At least he has a little bit more tread on the tire. They restructure his deal, get more money, whether it's Mike Evans or whomever they decide to give. It can be a Derrick Henry, whoever they decide to get to add to that lexicon of a team. I mean, my God, it is scary. I agree with you. It is absolutely scary. We talk about GOAT conversations. We talk about Patrick Mahomes getting closer to Brady, but do we crown these athletes too soon? We talk, and there was a thing about Caitlin Clark, who I think is absolutely phenomenal. She's a pure shooter. I'm looking forward to watching her in the WNBA this upcoming season. Her, Angel Reese, but do we put too much emphasis on these crowning them the next blank versus just letting them grow into that if they happen to grow into it? Because I don't know.
Well, I mean, seeing somebody as the next is not a big deal. But like to your point, it's when we start crowning them way too early. Like, it's unfortunate because the Caitlin Clark conversation has gotten entirely too toxic. I think there's some cultural, racial undertones there that are very obvious. They are just blaring to me. And I agree with you. Like, she is phenomenal. I mean, like, there is no question about it. She's bringing a sizzle to the women's game that is very different. And I think that is what makes her very exciting to watch. But I've been watching women's basketball for 30 years. And I love him, great commentator, entertaining as hell. But when Shaq called her the greatest player ever, I'm like, bro, we gotta relax because there's a lot of people who frankly don't watch women's basketball that often or haven't watched it as consistently as the rest of us that do not understand that how disrespectful that is to a lot of women. Like, for one, I think the GOAT conversation for women's basketball is way harder than men's. Okay, because they, a lot of women did not get the opportunities that the women have now. And even when you look at how the game has evolved, there is more athleticism in the women's game. It's definitely faster than it used to be. But when Cynthia Cooper got into the WNBA, she was dominating in her early to mid 30s. All right. And the reason she was is because there was no, up until that point, any professional outlet for her in America. And people forget the work that she put in college. Like Cheryl Miller could play today. And Cheryl Miller is, I think, the greatest women's basketball player ever. Go check the records. All right. And if we're gonna have a GOAT conversation, and I know in women's basketball it's different because that's where you tend to see dynasties that last a long time. So I don't even hold necessarily rings against her. I think it has to be, to be in the GOAT conversation, it has to be a combination of statistics and rings. Okay, she has the all-time scoring record, and it's a phenomenal record. But it's hard for me to call you the greatest women's player ever and you don't have any championships. And you look at like Breanna Stewart, who has multiple, Diana Taurasi, multiple, Cheryl, like there's Maya Moore, Shamika Holesclaw, like it's so many women in this field. And Cheryl Swoops, Cheryl Swoops' championship should be, and I know she obviously got embroiled in some controversy because of the things she said about Caitlin Clark. But Cheryl Swoops won a national championship at a time where Tennessee was the dominant program. And I don't think people realize how hard that was to do at that time. It was very hard. We talking about the early 90s. That was like Tennessee's time. They were running folks, okay? And so for her to win one at Texas Tech, of all places, and she had I think she had the record for the most points in a championship game. She had 47. Like Cheryl Swoops was a whole phenomenon. Air swoops. She had her own shoe. Like, hey, I know it's so easy to get recency bias, but GOAT conversations are supposed to be fun. And you want to take players of equal caliber and have that conversation. But where it becomes less fun is when they're crowned too early and when people do not have a clear understanding of the history. And I know people might think that that's a little hypocritical for me to say because I just wrote a column. I didn't call Patrick Mahomes the greatest quarterback ever. What I said is that we're probably, and I didn't think we'd be having this conversation so soon, but when you look at his first 7 years of his career, and that's not to say he'll keep this up, for the next 8 years, but it is to say that when you combine talent with records, with MVPs, with Super Bowls, we're probably looking at the dude that's on a collision course to be the greatest quarterback of all time. And that's a different thing than say, oh, he's already the greatest. He's not already the greatest.
Nah, I won't even put him in the conversation for me until he gets 4. Because I think when you look at Joe Montana, when you look at those guys, I think that's when you can start really intelligently start that conversation. But I agree with you. I think he's definitely on his way. And as far as Caitlin Clark is concerned, I think she could be a great college player once it's all said and done and she moves into the W. I had no problem with Cheryl Swoops, what she said. I think, first of all, if anybody can speak on it, it's Cheryl freaking Swoops. Mm-hmm. I think she wasn't lying. I think she was telling the truth. And she wasn't hating on Caitlin or Angel for that, man, because she did mention Angel Reese.
Because she said the same thing about Angel Reese.
Exactly.
I think the only issue was like, yes, Cheryl did get some facts wrong, but they were corrected within the same conversation. Because when she says she shoots 40 times a game, she does not shoot 40 times a game. And when she said like maybe she's getting the record because it's her 5th year, and it's not, she does have a 5th year that she could take because she has her COVID year. Right. And so I think, people focused on that and they didn't really pay attention to what she was saying. The only thing she said was all rookies who come into the WNBA are going to struggle. Sabrina Ionescu, based on what she did in college and her rookie year, she struggled. So, and she is considered probably the greatest shooter in the women's game right now. All right. You saw she almost beat Steph in the 3-point contest and she struggled coming into the league. Right. And she was shooting, by the way, from the men's 3-point line, not the women's. Right. And so I say like that's natural because there's a different physicality in the WNBA. Nobody's saying that Caitlin Clark's going to come to the WNBA and like not do anything. But what she was saying is that these dominating 30, 40 point performances that you're seeing now, she may not get those right away because she's going against a different caliber of player. In the WNBA, even with teams that are not as successful as, say, the New York Liberty or the Las Vegas Aces, teams are loaded because there's not enough roster spots for the level of talent. So the level of talent that she's going to face in the WNBA is significantly greater than what she's seeing now. Not by a little, but by a lot.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Because in the league, she's gonna have to chase Kelsey Plum, whose record she just beat. And you know what I mean? Sabrina is who she gonna have to guard. All right. Like it's gonna be a different level. And so as a rookie, as any rookie would, she's gonna definitely be able to get her points. So I'm not saying it's gonna be one-sided, but it's gonna be two sides to this. And you know, if she doesn't come out right away dominating, I wouldn't be surprised. And by dominating, I mean to the level she's doing now.
Mm. No, absolutely. And I say even with Sabrina Ionescu, I think she's a good player. I've always said I think she's an incredible shooter. But I think I think she's a bit overhyped because you're trying to put this narrative in here. And to me, she's the third best player on her team currently. Stewie
That's
and
fair.
JJ. Stewie and
Yep, that's
JJ are
definitely fair.
better than
Definitely
her
fair.
right now.
Definitely fair.
Okay. So for me, I have an issue. I don't know where you stand with this, but I had an issue as far as how the league is marketing certain players over other players. And the one thing that it grinds my gears is the fact of Asia Wilson not getting the true respect because she is the face that runs the place.
You know, and this is something that, and I think you know this, is like in the circles, you know, in WNBA circles, particularly, let me be frank, among the Black women, that's a conversation being had.
Mhm.
And you know, you look at Asia, you look at even Aaliyah Boston when she was in college, right? Aaliyah Boston, great player. I mean, great player. And, but yet, that's not who I think Aaliyah and Sabrina were in college at the same time, if I'm not mistaken. And Sabrina became more of the face of women's college, basketball. So there's a lot of Black women who play in the league who feel like Black women are not promoted the same way and marketed the same way as somebody like a Caitlin Clark or Sabrina, or even for a time, Breanna Stewart. Like a lot of when Sue Bird was in the league, like and that's why I appreciated, if you recall a few years ago when Paige Beckers accepted that award at the ESPYs, I think for maybe best female college player,
Yeah.
or best female athlete, might have been that. And she made it very clear that her success and the growth of the game overall was on the backs of Black women who don't often get the same level. And that's why everybody loved that speech, who often don't get the same credit that they deserve for how they have advanced, the game. And, even when you want to look at last year, where you have Angel Reese talking trash, she's a personality player, hitting her with the ring finger, and America lost their mind. And it was just, you could even see it in the reaction and even the level of hate that Angel Reese still gets. And so that is not something that Caitlin Clark can control. But at the same time, it is bothersome to see how sometimes Black women, much like Black male athletes, are characterized and stereotyped in their own, particular sports. I said it last year when the women's championship game, I almost had more viewers than the men's championship game. I said these women, women's basketball is now having their Larry Bird, Magic Johnson moment, because that was a lot of the undercurrent too. When those two, those two are what got the NBA off tape delay. And part of it was the racial undertones. It wasn't something they were feeding into, but we live in a country that is racially divided. So here you have Magic Johnson, Black player against, Larry Bird from the sticks of Indiana, and everybody was projecting their racial issues onto that meetup, and it was a little bit more than just the two best players in the country. And I still think that their championship game is still the highest rated men's championship game of all time. And I think a lot of that, we see it in boxing all the time, or used to. When you got a black boxer and a white boxer, it's gonna be some undercurrents. It's just it's kind of what it is.
Hey, that's the world we live in, and
It's the world, yeah.
and I understand what the W's trying to do. They're trying to get team rivalries, but to me, I even said this to the commissioner. Like, where is the Asia versus Stewie? I mean, that's your, like you said, Magic and Bird. That's your LeBron and Kobe. That's
Yeah.
though to me, that's what people. To me, that finals begins the Liberty and the Aces. And the way the Aces came back and whooped that ass, which I'm so happy for because I covered Aces. Um, but it was just an amazing. I mean, people actually tuned in. I mean, just going on social media and just seeing that game 4 where they came back down the entire game was phenomenal for the women's game and for the women's sport.
Yeah, because I think now the league, because the popularity is exploding, and to me the turning point, even though it had been a steady rise, but this is the explosion's happening now, and the turning point was COVID, because when you had when we were all at home and really couldn't go anywhere, the W got a lot of new fans, because they were on much more wider access on television too. They were
Mhm.
also in the wubble, as they called it, and because of that, they have been able. Ratings have gone up practically every year, especially the last 5 years, and significantly, not little jumps, big jumps. And I think because it is becoming more a personality driven league, which I think is good. And I like to remind people, because it's very ironic to me that the same people who staunchly are defending Caitlin Clark now, I bet if you went through a lot of their tweets previously, they'd say nobody's watching women's basketball, but now all of a sudden they team Caitlin Clark, and I think we know why. But anyways, what I will say is that I get frustrated with people when people try to compare where the WNBA now to where the NBA is now. I was like, no. If you're gonna make a comparison, what is this? What are we, almost 30 years into the WNBA? Look at where the NBA was almost 30 years in. That's your comparison. If you're trying to make a little bit of a comparison, I still don't think you can, because women didn't have the same access to sports as men historically have not. So of course they were going to get off to a later start. But I think everything happening in the league right now is, both at the college level and the pro level, is extraordinary. The thing about the women's game, they have a significant edge, especially in college, because you're going to get to know these players. They have to be there for right now 3 or 4 years. And if Caitlin Clark comes back as big of a star as she is now, I mean, I can't imagine. And Angel Reese, by the way, has the same option, is that she could come back another year. And if Caitlin Clark decides that she wants to make one more run at it, that's something that even adds even more popularity and intrigue, to the league. And if Iowa's able to make a Final Four, I think they really got a significant shot at, and not that always has to be the goal. Is not always to beat the men or be better than the men. These are two different games, but I think it will say something about the growth and potential of the league. And same in the WNBA. I love that these super teams are forming. I love what Seattle is doing by getting Skylar Diggins, getting NECA. I mean, because what that not only shows, it's not about super teams, it's about investment. And it shows that now that there's a new crop of owners in the WNBA that are not NBA owners, but people who really wanted to own a WNBA team, you're seeing their investment. They want to win. And I said this when people used to always write those asinine columns when it was their time. And, of course, UConn wiped a lot of teams. They wiped a lot of teams to win championships. And inevitably somebody would write or commentate every year, is UConn bad for women's basketball because they're destroying these teams? No, they're good, because what that's going to do, shame works. And they're going to shame other programs and teams into raising their level of investment in these players and in building these programs. And that's exactly what happened. Because 15 years ago, you couldn't imagine South Carolina dominating the way they are now. I'm looking at these new faces and the fact that the talent is more spread out. You know, somebody like Clayton Clark is going to, 20, 25 years ago, is going to UConn or Tennessee and probably nobody else. Right. And so, because that's why they were able to have such loaded teams. So I think there's got to be a little bit of that in order to get everybody else to raise their level of investment.
Listen, I agree. I hope selfishly, I hope Caitlin and Angel come out this year because damn it, it's going to be
Yeah.
on fire. But the one to watch out for, and I tell people this, is Juju Watkins out
Oh
of
yeah.
USC.
I'm glad you said that because
Woo!
I was thinking and I was thinking when Caitlin Clark got that record, I was like, I don't know how long she gonna hold this record because Juju averaging 30 right now. In like the last 10 games. I mean, she's dropped a 50 burger already, like machine as a freshman. I'm like, man, I mean, she just broke I think a long record that Cheryl
Yeah.
Miller had. Yeah, she just broke a record of hers. I think it's for points per game or something like that. But she is a dynamo. But that gets to your point about marketing, right? And I know it doesn't sometimes help when you're on the West Coast. But Juju Watkins should be heavily marketed. She's got the name, definitely got the game. And, because I believe her and Bronny both went to the same high school, correct? And so Juju is somebody that if you're not just USC, but the NCAA period, you need to be putting the machine behind her.
Well, it sounds like you already got the slogan already ready, Jamel. Sounds like you need to go in there and do some marketing because that's a T-shirt right there. You got the name. You definitely got the game. I
Got the
mean,
name and the game.
yeah,
That's always a winning marketing combination.
talk about having the game. You in the podcast space with Jamel and Hill Unbothered, and you being able to venture off and really be successful in that. I mean, you've had some really incredible, compelling guests over the years that you've done it. Um, in your estimation, I mean, we see Club Shay Shay who's doing enormous numbers, and Shannon Sharp. I give a lot of credit to Shannon Sharp and the great job that he's doing. You see Stephen A. now venturing off into YouTube, and obviously, other podcasters. But is it hard for women, especially women of color, to be able to get the respect and to be able to break into those other areas like the men I have been able to break into? Both great guests. It's just I
Mhm.
don't see like, okay, I see Shay Shay, I see Stephen A, I see Busting with the Boys, but I don't see Jemele Hill being thrusted out there as far as she said, or even a Carrie Champion for that matter. When you all are doing shows.
Well, I mean, it's so funny though because I said this to some of my friends. I was like, "Wow, it was funny." It's like I had Cat Williams on my podcast 3 years ago, I think, and it was a wonderful interview. And a lot of things he said, he didn't go in as hard on Steve Harvey, but he definitely went, on Kevin Hart and some other people. But I was under a different model. And the model was that, well, one, Spotify was just really getting into the podcast game. And I think, their strategy was off the mark. Their strategy was that they wanted to draw as many subscribers as possible. So they put me behind a paywall, and
Mm.
when you're a growing podcast, it's like, and then I was only exclusive to Spotify. So my podcasts weren't on Apple, they weren't wide, and then they weren't doing video, even though it was at a time where people were really starting to like go to YouTube and like they want video podcasts. A lot of people don't even realize podcasts are podcasts. They think they're TV shows just because they're on YouTube. And so I think they were just behind. Frankly, they were a little bit behind into how they marketed it. But I would say, even though to your point, I'd love to see more women in that position. I am happy to see the growth of Black podcasting in general, uh, because it was, I think at one point, not for lack of talent, it was like lack of investment. There's so little information, and I learned this during my time at Spotify. There's so little information and so little investment into catering to Black audiences. That doesn't mean other people are excluded, but there's a cultural connection that you make first, and then everybody else joins the party. And there at one time, the only podcast of note that people knew that were Black podcasters were Joe Budden's podcast, which paved the way for, frankly, a lot of Black podcasters that eventually came to Spotify, myself included. He was a big reason why I came there, and then they broke up too. And the Breakfast Club. And the Breakfast Club is not a podcast, it's a show. But when you would look at the metrics, those were the two Black podcasts, so to speak, that you would see in the top 10 and among the highest rated episodes. So I think that there's definitely been a market established because of Shannon. Even Cameron and Mace, I think them doing their thing, that people have started to understand the way we talk about sports is different. The way Black people talk about sports is different. There's a cultural lens we're seeing sports through that is different, that is underserved, and they're starting to pay attention to that. Now the next evolution has to be getting more women and putting them in positions to not just tee up men and hear their opinions, but to drive content. And so, as I consider some podcasting opportunities, not just with replatforming my own podcast, Jemele Hill is Unbothered, but also considering some other opportunities, I think that I would like to see more mindful attention paid to that. I love to see, and I said this before, and people thought it was controversial. I'd love to see a Black podcaster get a Joe Rogan deal. You know, Joe Rogan reportedly signed for his latest deal is $250 million. I would love to see one of us get that kind of deal, you know, because that audience is definitely there. So yeah, selfishly, I would absolutely love to see a woman being centered in this talk space as much as I've seen some men being centered.
Yeah, I would love to see a Black man and a Black woman get those type of deals because I think
Hmm.
that's essential. And I think the person that may be the closest right now will probably be Shannon Sharp because
I would totally agree.
Shannon is killing the game right now.
Yeah.
Two last things before I let you get on out of here. We talk about you made a comment, and I was glad that you made this comment. A couple other people did too. A couple other journalists that were Black and white made this comment about hip hop journalism, and basically to paraphrase, hip hop journalism is pretty much it's dying, right? As far as just the tradition, what we know as journalism, to be able to report and have that cultural connection. And we also talk about culture vultures. You know, we talk about Adam 22, Vlad, which you also appeared
Hmm.
on.
Hmm.
Do you, where do you see hip hop journalism going? Is the first part of my question. And the second part is, do you regret being on that Vlad platform, especially knowing the way that people perceive that platform?
Well, the fans ain't gonna come after me because I was on Vlad. I didn't even know that was a thing till after I was on there. I was like, oh, people gonna hear and snitch on themselves. I'm like, I ain't got no business to snitch. So I felt like I was fine. So, but I think there's room where things get into trouble is when there's no balance. There's got to be balance in the force, and certainly seeing, say, Drink Champs, love what Drink Champs is doing. But Drink Champs, they're not hidden about their purpose. Their purpose is to show, their purpose is to, I think Noriega, he said it before, is that Nori said like he wants to give flowers to artists while they're here. And that is the purpose of his podcast. And I think that's a fine purpose. Nori is not a journalist. And I'm not
Thank
saying
you. Thank you for saying that. I've said that too. Thank you. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to
I'm
interrupt
not.
you.
No. I no. And I'm not being a hater by saying that. Again, I think there is definitely, obviously, a market for the type of podcast that he does. But and you know, and I'm glad actually so many artists go on there. But I guess the more upsetting thing is that there's no critique of hip hop in the way by like people who study it, or and by critiquing hip hop, I don't mean who has a good album or who doesn't. I mean the type of journalism that Danielle Smith was doing when she was at Vibe, or Dream Hampton does, or and or Kevin Powell, like that part of it is missing because look, I know how artists are. They sensitive to some degree about their product, but and they often choose platforms that they know will be favorable to them. And I look, every interview doesn't have to be about raking people over the coals, but I think there are questions and analysis missed because on a lot of these platforms by their peers, the peers see them as part of the club. Like we're all in the club together, and I want to stay in the club. And you know, I'm here to make you look as good as possible. I've told this to many people that I've interviewed across my years, and athletes has been my main business. I'll give you fairness, not favor. Those are two different things.
Mm.
Okay, fairness, not favor. So, like, if there's an obvious thing I have to ask you, and you don't want to answer that question, you could not answer it. I will ask you anyway. And I tend to personally, I turn down a lot of interviews with people who are like, don't even bring up that question. That ain't me. Like, because I'm not going to have the audience looking at me like, well, why did you ask him this? I'm like, this, because my job is not to be a stenographer. That's not my job. Okay. My job is to ask you questions about, about your art, about your work, your journey. And if there are tension points, I'm going to ask you about that too, if they are relevant to the conversation and to the time that we're in. And a lot of artists don't want that. They want um glowing PR, favorable interviews. And I don't think that makes them better. I mean, I think that there's the biggest component of journalism is truth. The second biggest component is accountability. That is, it's an old adage that I heard in journalism school. Our job is to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. That's our job. All right.
Well,
And,
yeah.
it doesn't make us the most liked people, but you can't be in journalism to be liked. And I tell younger journalism students that all the time. It's not about you being liked, it's about you being fair. And the whole point of this exercise is that journalism was created so that there would be the watchdogs of society. Somebody has to be mining the structure, somebody has to be holding those in power accountable. And unfortunately, and not just in hip hop, but even in sports across our landscape, period, you see a lack of holding people accountable. And what happens when you don't hold the powerful accountable, they tend to get away with murder at the people's expense.
Yeah, I mean, listen. Shout out to Nori and DJ EFN. I love what they're
Yeah,
doing. The
they're
Drink
good.
Champs,
Yes, they're very good.
Cam and Mace. That's one of my favorite shows. The Pivot, all the
Yes.
smoke. Like there are a lot of great shows out
Oh, it
there.
is. And I love that, by the way. Let me say, I love that athletes, especially, Draymond, they're getting into this
Hmm.
space because it's a reminder and a reflection of something the sports media did not do. And the sports media I'm gonna say does a horrible job of diversifying. Still 85 to 90% of sports media jobs are held by white men. And athletes got tired of walking into press conferences and walking into locker rooms and nobody in there looked like them, or very few people. And so they decided, because these are the people shaping their narratives and their legacies, and so they decided, we're tired of waiting on you to tell our story fairly and accurately. We're going to tell it ourselves. Simple as that.
And to that point too, I think when you talk about not seeing yourselves represented as far as on the media side, a lot of times those of us that are in the media cannot get into these locker rooms because you have PR
Correct.
gatekeepers
Yep.
and you have other people that are trying to keep us away from the athletes. It's like we try to get a question in with LeBron, for example. They're like, oh, well, we the same. That's why you hear that if you listen to LeBron's pressers, you hear the same 5 or 6 voices. There's no disrespect to them because they have a job to do. I understand that, but you rarely hear new voices being projected and asking questions to a person like LeBron James because you have certain things that enable us not to be able to be in those spaces.
And I would also say some of this, and again, the one thing I appreciate about the time that I came up during my journalism journey early on in my career. There were guys like Bill Rhoden, Michael Wilbon, who I would regularly see at events. They took me under their wing. Um, and the one thing I noticed in their relationship with athletes, especially black athletes, the black athletes felt a responsibility to look out for the Black reporters. And by look out, I mean knowing somebody like you is there in the press conference. Maybe 15, 20 years ago, the athlete knowing you and seeing your face on a regular basis would tell the moderator, hey, make sure you go to such and such. Or would say to you, if you need it, you could catch me walking down the tunnel and we can have our time, right? And I remember Bill Rhoden did this for years. Every year at the NBA, at the Final Four, the men's Final Four, he would have Black journalists and Black coaches get together for dinner. And that's the type of stuff that I don't think happens anymore, right? It's like, you know, the old school journalists, that's why they have such good relationships now with the people that they used to cover, because there was this mutual responsibility that they felt. As Black journalists, you felt a responsibility to report on people who look like you in a fair and thoughtful way. And the people you reported on felt an obligation to look out for Black journalists, knowing they didn't get the same opportunity as white journalists. And that part of the game is lost. And that is why, and especially now that the athletes can go directly to social media. And I know people think I'm a hater, but that's why, you know, seeing somebody like Bobby Altoff getting interviews with Drake, getting interviews with Offset, that's why that bothers me, because I know too many Black podcasters, journalists who can never get those interviews ever. And I think there's got to be some mutual responsibilities if we want to see a different kind of storytelling. They have got to decide, like, okay, we want to see, you don't sit up there and complain about how Black athletes are covered when you ain't giving no Black journalists an opportunity.
Yeah,
As
agreed.
simple as that. Like, if I see you just continually giving one-on-ones to like white journalists all the time, it's just like, hey man, there's a lot of Black journalists that could really use that lift in their career. And so I just think there's got to be a mutual responsibility there.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's got to change, and I agree it is a mutual responsibility. Real quick, I got to get your top 5 movies of all time
Oh, here
from
we go.
Jemele Hill. You know I'm gonna come for you.
Okay. So I know the first three, but actually I do know this. It's hard to rank. Well, my
No order,
favorite.
no order, no order.
No, I'm gonna give you no order. So
Okay.
it's Shawshank Redemption, The Color Purple, the movie, not the musical, or not the musical movie, that the one that just came out, and Imitation of Life,
Okay.
Coming to America, and Casablanca.
Oh, okay. All right.
That's my
I see.
5.
I see the diversity in that. Okay. All right.
Yeah,
All right. All
Casablanca
right.
might be the most perfect film ever made in
It's
terms of like,
definitely up there.
it's up
It's
there. And I know they're
yeah.
like, what are you, born in the 1800s? I'm like, no. But I remember I saw it, the first time I saw it was on an airplane. This was like years ago. Well, no, actually, it was a DVD. I'm sorry. Because it was like in the DVD bin for like $1.99 back when those were a thing.
Right.
And I said, you know what? I think I need to watch this. And because everybody talks about listed like as top 5 at worst of greatest movies ever. So I was like, let me watch this. And I was like, I get it now.
Well, you know what? It has definitely been a pleasure. It's definitely been an honor to speak with you. I thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to chat with us here on the NH Experience. Thank you so much, Jemele. Congratulations on all your success. Looking forward to the second wave of the Jemele Hill Unbothered podcast, as well as the upcoming Colin Kaepernick documentary that you are executive producing, as well as some other projects I'm sure you got coming down. So thank you so much. Appreciate your time, and look forward to talking with you soon.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate being here.
Thank you.
All right.